college is in a unique spot right now. And, I know on my podcast back in August, I went on record on here saying that I genuinely thought Boston College would make a bowl game this year. I thought to myself, hey, with the mix of the Bill O'Brien, just keep bringing a lot of positive energy into Chestnut Hill. You bring in Dylan Lonigan, who transferred from Alabama, and you're also building on the defensive side of the ball with a number of young contributors. And that just simply didn't work out that way, right? As Boston College finished 122nd nationally in terms of points per game, with just giving up roughly just 33 points per game, which under any circumstances just simply unsustainable in terms of winning games consistently. And here we are now. Bill O'Brien is going into his third year. Boston College saw a giant max exodus of players leaving for the transfer portal. They have approximately 30 players entering there. And, we're definitely going to see a cycle of some kids also coming in as well. I think they have about, 7 to 10 right now. So if I'm incorrect about that, somebody fix that in the comments. But nevertheless, a lot of these issues that I'm talking about, right, are going to be issues that Boston College is going to have no matter what, because, I think a couple things are going on, right? I think the administration, no matter what, is always going to see Boston College as an academic first school. And a lot of the administration and, the chancellor and all that stuff, they've even gone on record and said this and said, hey, athletics are always going to be on the back burner here. And, for the most part, it's the hockey program, sometimes the football program, and then everything else, right? Because even in the 2000s, right? I mean, had a handful of years of being able to be in bowl games or whatnot, but also it's a much different era right now, which I would argue doesn't benefit Boston College as much. Where you know Boston College's bread and butter is right there is getting those 3 and 4 star kids that are primarily probably 3 stars, but primarily getting overlooked within the Northeast, bringing them in, letting them develop for a year or two, and then becoming starters on the back end. Right, that's usually the bread and butter of Boston College's cycle. But fast forward to now, and that's where the balance is going to be difficult, because any really strong players that they have are simply going to get poached by the bigger schools. And especially when now you're in the ACC with a whopping 17 teams, you're just only going to get lost more and more into it. So how do they figure that out? I think there are a couple things that they can do, right? I'd say first and foremost, the defensive side of the ball has to be completely overhauled, right? I mean, a very inconsistent pass rush, a lot of big explosive plays have been given up, and ultimately the defense was just very inconsistent throughout the season. And I think you saw a bunch of examples of that, whether you want to talk about closer games when they played Cal and Georgia Tech, or if you want to talk about complete blowout games such as Pittsburgh or all that good stuff. But they bring in Ted Roof, who had a relationship with Bill O'Brien for a very long time there on the Bill O'Brien actually hired Ted Roof back when he took over for Penn State. He They were also in the same staff together at Georgia Tech, and Ted Roof was last defensive coordinator at UCF under Gus Malzahn. And I think if you're a Boston College fan, I think you have to be petrified to see that Ted Roof is your defensive coordinator. In many ways, this kind of feels like when Mike Gundy hired Todd Granahan at Oklahoma State. Everybody knew that it was a bad idea, but they still went with it anyway. And I think it's one of those examples of you can't necessarily hire your buddies for your coordinator jobs, because I'm not trying to take away anything from Ted Roof. I'm not even going to go into him as a head coach at Duke, because I think that's water underneath the bridge now, right? But anyways, it's the problem is that Ted Roof has not shown any sort of evidence of being able to really turn around any sort of defense at all. There's a reason why, if you look at his rap sheet, go on Wikipedia and look it up. There's a reason why he primarily hasn't been at a school longer than 3 seasons. And it's because it's a shit show every time that he's there. And I think you Boston College fans, I think we're going to be having this conversation in October, in early to late October, about how rough this defense is going to look. Because I don't care if you bring in Deuce Knight as your quarterback, who by the way would be an awesome get for Kenyatta Watson and this Boston College program. I think he would be phenomenal here. But at the same time, I think your defense is still gonna hurt you. Because I mean, even if you look at let's look at some of the recruiting guys that they have now. And by the way, they're 51st in the country per on 3 sports. The only teams that they're ahead of in the ACC are Duke, which is 61st, and also Virginia. I think they're ranked somewhere in the 80s. But here's who they got. They got 25 recruits so far, all primarily 3 stars in the Northeast. Their top guy is Mason Leak, 4-star kid from Connecticut, who, by the way, I don't think is getting a lot of initial playing time, because the one thing that Boston College does have going for him is, particularly within the front 7, there are a lot of young kids who will probably get cycled in. I think Mason Lee can kind of get lost in the shuffle there. So maybe it could be a good year for him to kind of be a red shirt perhaps. But, after the injury bug that they've had last season, who knows, maybe he will get some initial playing time. But, the one thing that Boston College does have going for him is there's a lot of youthful kids here. I think bringing in a guy like Kenyatta Watson at least says to me, as a casual fan, kind of says to myself, you know what? At the very least, they're at least interested in trying to become a better football team, and we'll see what happens on the field. But for now, this just feels like a team that just has a lot of moving parts, right? And it was fascinating, right? Because the reason why Deuce Knight took the visit to Boston College first, by the way, is because Kenyatta Watson is also the guy that made him commit to Auburn initially. So he came from Auburn to Boston College. And, if that could be a really massive grab, right? Because he's a 5-star kid. He's freakishly athletic. He's a guy that can bring another layer of versatility to an offense that, quite frankly, Boston College simply didn't have last year. And I don't think Dylan Larnigan is that bad of a quarterback. I think he's shown flashes of what he can do, but it seems like one of those things where, you know what, let him go to Rutgers. It's not the end of the world. But, because Bill O'Brien, I think, is definitely an underrated coach. I think he's one of those guys that I think gets a little bit too much criticism, particularly for people who kind of only focus on his moves as general manager of the Houston Texans. But guess what? He doesn't have to be the general manager now. He's at a place at Boston College where they should hopefully be a little bit more patient with him. He's at a place that I think he genuinely enjoys being at him being in the twilight of his career. And, most importantly, at least they finished with some momentum this season. I mean, they finished the year beating a Syracuse team that I would argue was probably on the ropes in a lot of different ways, particularly just because of how difficult their schedule was. But they also played tough against some really, really solid teams. I think of that Cal game towards the middle of the season. I also watched fully Boston College and Georgia Tech, which, by the way, if Boston College could have even put together one solid defensive stand at the end of the game, I think we would be having a completely different conversation of how that game turned out. But nevertheless, I think this is kind of going to be the catch-22 in terms of what else they kind of need to focus on besides the defense side of the ball. Is this offensive line needs to be completely overhauled. And I think one of the things about Lonigan that I think a lot of people tend to overlook is the fact that this Eagles team, they ranked at the bottom 15 in terms of sacks allowed in the country, which is almost 3 sacks a game. And when your quarterback is not only getting sacked 4 times a game, but also getting pressure on a lot of his throws, it's just simply unsustainable model. And it's one of those things where not only are you giving up a lot of sacks, but you're not getting a lot of pass rush on the other side of the ball as well, which forces a lot of these guys in the secondary to play really lax coverage and ultimately end up giving up a lot of explosive plays. But overall, here's where you're at right now, right? Bill O'Brien has signed a really solid group of prospects right now. They also have another guy in Marique Jin, who's an offensive lineman, 3-star kid who I would anticipate probably getting some playing time relatively early. You are also in a spot where a lot just needs to be proven right now, right? Because, they did have Isaiah Bond, who, he's a senior, so that's unfortunate. He was one of my favorite players to watch in the ACC and with this Boston College team. but this just feels like a rebuild year in many ways. I don't know if we can necessarily sit there and say that they can make a bowl game. I think obviously reaching a bowl game should be the goal and the anticipation every single year at Boston College, but it's just one of those things where the big question is going to be, is the decline going to continue? And I think if you're a Boston College fan, I think you have to be really nervous about them bringing a guy like Ted Roof. And I think if you're Kenyatta Watson, this Boston College team, you have to bring in a couple portal guys that can bring some more excitement, some more energy, and kind of prove to the entire country like, hey, we're not just gonna be a bunch of pushovers like we were last season. Because obviously 2-10 last season is just simply an unsustainable model, especially when for the most part a lot of these games were kind of blowouts once you get to the third and fourth quarter. But overall, I mean, this Boston College team, they have a solid foundation in terms of I think Kenyatta Watson, like I said, is a monster deal. I think Bill O'Brien is a way better coach than people give him credit for. Most importantly, bringing a guy that actually wants to be there and is from the area, I think is always a monumental thing. But let's figure out who they're going to bring in as their quarterback. I think you have to bring in at least another portal guy or two. If you could find a way to get Deuce Knight, that's probably unlikely now given the situation of him now visiting Old Miss. You also are going to be testing a lot of guys in terms of your front seven who are primarily underclassmen. That's going to be a big question. And then most importantly, the secondary as well. A lot of these kids that they thought were going to be starting this season ultimately decided to transfer, and it's going to be a lot of moving parts. But let me know what you think in the comments about Boston College. But to me, this seems like a troubling trend, but also a sign that this rebuild will take more than 1 or 2 seasons. We could be talking about this in a 3-year context, and it's just a matter of how patient is Boston College going to be with Bill O'Brien, and how patient is Bill O'Brien going to be with himself in terms of turning this thing around.